So today starts a new series called Table Talk, and we're going to be looking at really critical things that God discloses to us, to his followers, to his chosen people over the course of meals. It's going to be, I think, a really interesting short series for us to dive into. But let me start it off like this with a question. Have any of you guys ever been in the position where you're at work and your boss comes walking by and kind of taps you on the shoulder and you look up and they're like, hey, can I speak to you in my office in a few minutes? And you're like, about what? Right? You're like, yeah, okay. And then you sit there and you're worried, like, what on earth could this be about? Does my boss know that I've been slacking off a little bit? That my numbers aren't what they're supposed to be, the sales are down, or that I've been coming in late to work or something, right? Like, how could they know? Or maybe it has nothing to do with you at all, and your boss wants to talk to you about the state of the company overall. Perhaps, like in this year, the company's struggling a bit financially, and they want your information or your input, or maybe something worse, right? Like maybe it's a discussion, hey, numbers are down, cash is tight, and we're going to have to talk about what your next move might look like. It's anxiety building. Yeah? You're like, oh dear, what could this possibly be? Maybe they just saw what you posted about the company on a late Friday night that you just shouldn't have ever put on social media. Like, it could be anything. Who knows? But when your boss taps you on the shoulder and says, I want to meet with you, the bottom line is you're a little nervous. And so the time comes and you start walking towards their office space. Maybe there's a doorway or a threshold, and you get up to it, and the walk there was full of trepidation. Or you're going up the elevator and you're just like panic breathing for a second. Nobody can see you, so you're just maybe screaming it out like, oh, what's this going to be? So you get there and you're like, oh man, you got to put your hand on the door or walk over the threshold. What do you usually do? Okay. Right? Take a deep breath, center yourself, open the door, and walk in and meet your fate. The unknown in those situations is what's anxiety producing, yes? And it's not just when you're talking to your boss. Maybe you're at school and you're getting called down to the principal's office, and you're like, oh no, maybe they know that I'm the one who destroyed the locker, and then who knows what's going to happen. Or maybe you need to have a discussion with your spouse that I don't know how they're going to respond. Or even just a good friend. You need to give an update or a situation, and the unknown about how that's going to affect your relationship just puts you on edge. Let me go ahead and one up the anxiety level in the room today and raise the stakes. Imagine this isn't your boss at your job who taps you on the shoulder and says, I want to meet with you. Imagine it's God himself who says, hey, can you meet me on the mountain? Imagine the anxiety when it's not just your boss who doesn't know you that well, but the God of the universe who intimately knows everything about you, who wants to have a personal discussion. The situation today, the story, the context is Moses is going to tap some Israelites, some of his fellow Israelites, on the shoulder and say, hey, impromptu meeting with God on the mountain, are you game? Could you imagine being selected amongst the people to have that communication with God? Let me one up this again. This isn't just cold out of the blue, who cares about the mountain? No. This is Mount Sinai in the Exodus moment, in the wilderness wandering, and you don't go near the mountain. The mountain is the place where God is, and everybody's afraid of it. And just to make sure that their fear wasn't going to, have them overcome it and come close enough, God actually gives specific instructions a couple chapters before this to keep people away from the mountain. This is what it is. Exodus 19. He says this to Moses. Mark off a boundary all around the mountain. Warn the people, be careful. Don't go up to the mountain or even touch its boundaries. Anyone who touches the mountain will surely be put to death. No hand may even touch a person or animal that crosses the boundary. Instead, stone them or shoot them with arrows. They must be put to death. That is the backdrop to Moses tapping you on the shoulder and say, hey, meeting on the mountain, let's go. Like, I thought we couldn't walk past the line. And you can imagine the time in between God's warning and this meeting being scheduled. The Israelites probably saw goats or sheep or something pass that line and have to get shot in the back with arrows. This is not something that they were interested in doing. This was a really scary thing. But now Moses has grabbed your hand and it says, let's go up the mountain. And he starts walking past the death line. you'd be taking a few deep breaths, wouldn't you? You'd be having anxiety-filled prayers, trying to confess anything that could possibly have happened between you and the Lord, right? Like, oh dear, close your eyes and be like, this is a really, really scary moment. Let me raise the stakes even higher. In Exodus 20 through 23, so between the warning and the time where they're going up on the mountain, God has given his covenant to the people. He's outlined it. This is where you get the 10 Commandments and a bunch of other laws. And he has said, this is what it's going to take to be my people and to live under my blessing and inherit the promised land. And the people have looked at that law, they've considered, and they said, okay, we're going to do this. And if they don't do it, if they don't live up to the standard, let's just say things aren't going to turn out well. So this is a heavy, heavy moment. So heavy that Moses comes down from the mountain in 24c and says this. He repeats, He went down to the mountain and repeated all the instructions and regulations and that the Lord had given him. And all the people answered with one voice and said, we will do everything the Lord has commanded. So they've been given this list of things that you and I would look at and be like, oh man, that's going to be too tough. But they don't have a lot of options. And so they say, okay, God, we're going to do it. So Moses, the next day, sets out to set up what's called a covenant ritual. He builds an altar. And he builds 12 pillars to symbolize the 12 tribes of Israel. And he asks for some animals to come for a sacrifice. He gets a bull, drains its blood, splashes some of the blood on the altar and the pillars. And then he turns to the people. And I think it's a hilarious line. He repeats everything again. Verse 7b. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it out loud to the people. Essentially, in my mind, saying, are you guys sure about this? This is a tense moment. This is important. And what do? They all responded, we will do everything the Lord has commanded. We will obey. So Moses splashes the rest of the blood on them, and they have symbolically entered into covenant with God. And in this moment, it's a little bit more than just the nasty graphic scene that we envision here. Like, nobody wants to get splattered with blood. In the ancient world, they knew what was going on. When they said, yes, we will obey, and got sprinkled, they were saying, if I don't obey, may I become like this bull, slaughtered, and my blood poured out all over the place. They were this was a big, big moment, not to be taken lightly, so much so that Moses has to say, are you guys sure about this? Before we finish it off. So when the ceremony ends, Moses looks up at the people who are all freshly spattered in blood, and he goes, you, not you, definitely not you, you, and he names off Moses and Joshua and Moses' sons and 70 elders, and he says, let's go up the mountain. You can imagine, in that moment, still blood spattered, they're like, what's it coming to go? What? Me? I know I said yes. I know I said I will obey. But really, within the 30 seconds of this occurring, I've already probably broken one of the 10 Commandments. I don't know if I can get anywhere close to God. It's gonna expose my unrighteousness. It's dangerous. I can't go past this death line, let alone into God's presence. Like, this is scary. This is next level. This is just not the possibility of losing your job. This is the possibility of losing your life. What are they going to do? So here's the story. Exodus 24:9 says this. Moses, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 elders of Israel climbed up the mountain. After, I imagine, they quickly confessed every sin they could imagine. And they have to kind of shake off the concrete that's on their feet as they're paralyzed in fear. And this is what happens. Verse 10 is astounding. It's something that you and I would be like, yes, awesome. But imagine how they must have felt it, the weight of this moment. Verse 10 says this. They went up the mountain, and there they saw the God of Israel. You and I would be like, yes, I want to see God. We sing songs like this, right? Like, show us your glory, show up. We want to see you. But in their context, they're thinking, Nobody can see God and live. Any unrighteousness that comes before him gets knocked dead. He's so pure, so holy, so righteous that I couldn't even get within 25 feet of the mountain. I imagine when they saw God, they were like, no, I'm undone. I'm dead. Am I still alive? Right? Sorry. Like, have I endured this moment? They see God, and under his feet there seemed to be a brilliance of blue as clear as the sky itself. It's amazing. I think the description here shows that they weren't trying to look up, right? They say they saw God's feet, and under the earth was awesome. They're like, I can't even look at his feet. I'm not worthy. It's not going to be good for me to look up, so I'm just going to talk about how awesome the ground was underneath. So the next line here would have been shocking for their fellow Hebrews to hear. Verse 11. And though these nobles of Israel gazed upon God, he did not destroy them. Other texts say lifted his hand against them. In fact, something they never expected, they ate a covenant meal together, eating and drinking in his presence. They walked up the mountain, expecting to find death and destruction and judgment, and they were offered a life-giving meal. Not what anybody ever saw. And I think this scene speaks volumes about God's character, because in this moment, he's saying, all that I've done for you to get to this point was for this. I literally just want to be able to have a meal with my friends. It was never meant to be more complicated than this. You were created to enjoy my presence and me to enjoy yours. This is about restoring a relationship that was lost, and I just want to eat with my buddies. Imagine the weight of that moment where you see God, and then he offers up this meal, and you're like, I don't deserve to be here. How is it that this is happening? And God says, this is what it was always about, bro. This is always what I wanted to do with you. It's amazing to me because God didn't want it to be more complicated than that, but it is, yeah, because we sinned. And we didn't just sin back then like we sin now. We sin regularly. We'll probably sin regularly in the future. We have broken faith with God, and we will likely continue to do it. But the moral of the story here is, like, God's still inviting us to the table. We just keep choosing to eat with the pigs. God has made a way multiple times, 100 times over. He says, I just want to be with you. And we keep saying, nah, I'm good with the slop. When are we going to figure things out? This story starts with a bunch of people hiking up a mountain to encounter God, and we quickly find that God's plans were always to come down. Because right after this moment where they have this meal, he gives instructions to Moses about how to build the tabernacle, his house among his people. He said, I'm not just interested in you coming up here in fear. I want to come down and be with you. It's all about having a restored, authentic relationship between creator and creation. God wants to be your buddy. So when we try to get to God in his holiness, we miss the mark because he's already come down. It's amazing to me how often we try to find ways to God and into his life-giving presence, and we miss the modes and opportunities he's already made available to us. Exodus 24 is a regular covenant ceremony meal. This is the same thing that happens nowadays in a lot of contexts. You may do business with somebody, and oftentimes, if that business goes late, you can we go get dinner together, right? Maybe we'll sign the contract after the meal, or we'll go and we'll toast to the agreement we've got. We've conducted business. Let's go be buddies. That we're no longer worried about X's and O's and numbers now. Let's just go dive into the relationship together. That's what's happening here. It happens in the Old Testament in lots and lots of places, and in the ancient Near East all over the place. We've got lots and lots of records. But the reality is, the way that God has made in this moment is only a placeholder. It's not all that God has in store, because the pathway to him is still restricted. It's still death-defying. It's full of terror. It's not all that he or you and I would hope for. But did you know that God's already working to make it even better? Isaiah kind of taps into this, and he thinks about this time where this meal that's happening with the 70 elders is expanded to the entire world and all who will trust in God. He says this in chapter 25, "In Jerusalem, the Lord of heaven's armies will spread a wonderful feast for all the people of the world." It's going to be delicious. You're going to want to be there. It's going to be a delicious banquet with clear, well-aged wine, choice meat. And there he's going to remove the cloud of doom. He visits Moses and the people of Israel, by the way, in Exodus in the form of a cloud. That's terrifying. He's going to remove that fear. He's going to remove the shadow of death that hangs over the earth. He's going to swallow up death forever. And the sovereign Lord himself, in restored relationship with you, will wipe away all your tears. That's all it was ever about, enjoying each other's presence. He'll remove forever all insults and mockery against his land and his people. The Lord has spoken. And then John, of course, taps into that idea with the wedding feast of the Lamb in Revelation chapter 19 as well. But we'll get there another week. I think it's important to note that so far at this point, a meal with somebody who's kind of like bigger and higher than you is a symbol of friendship and intimacy. And that stands against what is otherwise only shown in the Old Testament as a God who is like really scary and you don't want to get around for fear of your own life. It's amazing the contrast here, and we have to tap into it. Because usually when God shows up in the Old Testament or the New, he doesn't do it in like bodily form because we'd lose our minds. Instead, he shows up in the form of like an angel, right? A bearer of God's presence. Or he shows up in a crazy meteorological event like the cloud or lightning or a voice from heaven when the clouds open up, or the winds that Isaiah or Ezekiel experiences, right? Not Ezekiel. The word's escaping me. Help me out. Elijah, there it is. Goodness gracious. Forgot a major prophet. I'm your pastor, guys. Oh, dear. The point of the story is this. When God shows up, everybody loses their minds and say, I'm about to die. But God has revealed to the entire nation, the 70 elders, the whole goal of his redemptive energies and powers and purposes was for them to enjoy relationship with him. So we know the system's broken. The system's going to need to get better. Did you know that in Jesus we get a better system and things get better? Moses is unique in the Old Testament as somebody who kind of looks upon the Lord and lives. He still gets it mediated though, right? He sees the backside of Jesus, of God from behind a rock, like, ah! Wow, that's an amazing backside. We need somebody who can experience the unfiltered presence of God and show us it as well. The scripture's clear. God himself is life-giving presence. So how can it be that being around him could bring death? We need somebody different, somebody better than Moses, and that's basically what the whole book of Hebrews is trying to tell you. And if you read your Bible this week in our all-church Bible group, you would have read this verse from John 1:18. No one's ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, and he has made him known. See, no one was ever going to make it up to God's unfiltered presence, so God had to figure out a way to send them down. And that's who we have in Jesus. Somebody who experiences the unfiltered, amazing, life-giving presence of God, and whom, when we gaze upon his face, we see and experience that presence in the same way. If you have seen me, you have seen who? So I read this a few months ago in my Bible group with Josh, and I made a connection that I hadn't ever really thought through before, and so I want to share it with you. Because there's a weird scene in all of the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There's this moment where Jesus takes a few people up a mountain, and all of a sudden he's radically changed and looks different. It's such a weird passage, by the way, that it was common in biblical scholarship in the 60s to say this is misplaced. This is probably a post-resurrection event or appearance. No. It's part of the story. It's part of the story that God was always trying to tell So it's important, though, to give you a little bit of context, because just like the Hebrews, when they start heading up the mountain, there was a story, there was a barrier, there was a covenant, there was an important moment where God then wanted to communicate his presence. There's an important moment right before Mark 9. See, there's this time where Jesus is with his disciples in Caesarea Philippi, and he turns to them and he says, "Who do you guys think I am?" And they're like, they give all these different answers, and he says, no, personally. Like, not who the average Joe thinks I am, not who your buddy thinks I am, not who the crowds keep shouting that I am, or who anybody wants me to be. Who do you, who have spent all of this time with me, believe that I am? And Peter pipes up. Peter always pipes up. And he says, "You're the Messiah." And then in other versions, he says, "You're the Messiah, the Son of the living God." There's a faith moment here, which instantiates, begins, or at least points towards this new covenant that was not about works and laws and regulations to get to God's presence. Because the people didn't die in the mountain because they'd just been sprinkled in blood. He'd taken care of their sin. A time is coming where these disciples were going to be sprinkled in somebody else's blood, spiritually speaking, and get unfiltered access to the Lord. So this is what has happened in advance of this time where they're about to head up a mountain. Peter has confessed him as Messiah in faith, and now that faith is going to lead to a hallmark moment where God reveals himself and his desire to have relationship with everybody else. Now, Moses takes Joshua and Aaron and his buddies and these 70 elders, and they know that they're heading on a treacherous journey. Peter, James, and John, who Jesus taps on the shoulder, they don't know what's going on. They just think they're going up on a mountain to pray. And they're about to have a rude awakening with God's presence. This is how it goes. Mark 9, 2-4 says, 6 days later, Jesus took Peter, James, and John and led them up a mountain to be alone. It's like he didn't tell them what was going to happen. And as the men watched, Jesus' appearance was transformed. His clothes became dazzling white, far whiter than any earthly bleach could make them. And then, like to one-up things, Elijah and Moses appeared, and they started talking with Jesus, just having an average Joe conversation. And in this moment, Peter, like you or I, loses his mind. This is what he says. Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it's good for us to be here." I imagine him talking like, "It's really, really good to be here. Let me build 3 shelters or booths or tabernacles. One for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." Am I yelling? Am I yelling? This moment's so jarring for him. I can think in his mind, really all he's thinking is, no! Is that Moses? Like, right? He's freaking out. Can we build tabernacles or booths? And for centuries, people have just laughed at this text. Like, what would you have said if you experienced the glory of God, right? Who knows? And so we just think, well, this means nothing. I tend to think it might actually mean something more than we give it credit for. But let me balance that with the fact that the next verse kind of talks about it being a little bit silly. It says in verse 6, he said this because he really didn't know what else to say. And he was terrified. He was petrified. But could there have been some other truth in there? Here's what continues. Then a cloud shows up on a mountain, just like it did in Exodus 24. Peter, James, and the voice on the cloud says, "This dude, this guy, is my dearly beloved Son. Listen to him." And then suddenly, everything changes. The cloud is gone. Moses and Elijah are gone, and they only are left with Jesus. Only Jesus. I imagine Peter, James, and John were looking at each other like, did that just happen? Did my eyes communicate truth about reality in this moment? You can imagine they're probably thinking like, did we eat weird mushrooms or something? Like, what just happened? You all saw that, right? Peter, what were you thinking when you said they would have this whole conversation? Was that Moses? Was that Elijah? Why did Jesus look like that? Moses, Elijah are gone, the cloud's gone, they're left with plain old Jesus. And so as I reflected on this a little bit, and I thought about the whole ordeal, I thought, Peter would have been celebrating the festival of tabernacles or booths every year growing up. It was this moment in Israelite culture where every year they would make these little booths, these little shelters, and they kind of sit out in them. And it was meant to remember the time where they relied on God's presence in the tabernacle in the wilderness as their sustaining presence. It was meant to be a kind of a time where we remembered and we hope for when God would dwell with us in his fullness again and we could enjoy his presence. I imagine when Peter saw Elijah and Moses and Jesus transfigured, he sees this cloud and he says, this is good. It's good for me to be here. He's not just blabbering out random stuff. He knows that God's presence is life. And he wants to figure out a way to hang out with it a little bit longer. Can we build a booth for you and maybe enjoy a meal together? I imagine Exodus 24 flashed through his mind. Am I going to get to eat with God? What's he going to say to me? But the moral of this story is slightly different than the moral of Exodus 24 because that doesn't happen. Flash, bang, gone. Moses and Elijah just disappear as fast as they can. The cloud dissipates and they're left with plain old Jesus. But here's the truth. Regular old Jesus is all you need because there's nothing regular about Jesus. They were looking to spend time with God's presence. Turns out they've been doing it all along. They just didn't know. Jesus, God's Son, perfect reflection of the Father. I and the Father are one. If you've seen me, you have seen the Father. No one has seen the Father except God's only Son, who has now revealed him to you. They had been walking and talking with God's unmediated presence through Jesus. Jesus is all you need. They wanted to eat with Yahweh. Moses, hero of the faith. Elijah. Turns out in just a few chapters, they're going to eat with Jesus in the meal that they needed but never expected, which we'll dive into next week. You know, some people are looking for God. They're looking for God's life-giving presence. They're looking for a way to spend time with him, and they pass on regular old Jesus. But there's no other way to the presence that we all need. So today, if you're trusting in Jesus, you're going to be amazed at what you find and experience. You're going to be amazed at the way that God's holy, amazing other presence invades your everyday life. Did you know that today, if you are trusting in Jesus, you don't need to build shelters for God anymore? Because you are his tabernacle. God has made a way to come down and be with his people. All he ever wanted was to be a part of your life and you to enjoy his life. And in Jesus, all of that is made possible. So the question today is this. It's really simple. Are you enjoying God's presence today? Because Jesus literally died so you could. Why do we make it so much more